mic on here. Good afternoon. Today is August the 2nd, 2023, and it is 4:04 p.m. As a quorum of the board is in attendance, I'd like to call to order the meeting of the CentralHealth Board of Managers. First item of business is public communication. Members of the public who wish to make comments during public communication portion of the meeting must have registered with CentralHealth via the online form or by telephone no later than 2:30 p.m. I've been told that no one has registered today to make any comments for the Board of Managers meeting, so we will now proceed to the regular agenda. Regular agenda item number 1, review and ratify the proposed healthcare equity operational and financial sustainability plan, action plan. And the presenters will be Mike Giesland, Jeff Knodel, Monica Crowley, and along with Dr. Avi Sharma and Danielle Srinivasan from Guidehouse. Members, before we take up this agenda, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mike. And what he and I would like to do is to just briefly sort of outline some of the major points of our deliberation of the budget. Sort of going over what our situation is, where we are at this present time, understanding how to deal with the different requests that are coming in and how we want to deliberate about that, understanding how the budget is going to be laid out and our ability to be able to either propose changes to that budget and how we want to analyze and how we want to analyze any changes that we propose to make. So we'll be able to sort of ask questions as we go through and determine what our understanding is of what Mike is trying to tell us. Some of this will be repeat for members who've done budgets before, CentralHealth budgets before, and some of it will be new to some of you. So, Mike, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you.
For our audience, sort of a parliamentary inquiry.
Okay.
The item that you're discussing the budget in the context and in light of this item.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify that for the public, that we're not just running off on a budget discussion, since it's not really posted that way.
It's not a new item. It's just to introduce this item.
Perfect.
So that we'll have some context around how we want to discuss it.
Thank you for indulging me.
All right?
Thank you. Thank you. So, members, as Dr. Bell noted, this is a discussion that we have every year around this time of budget, so it'll be familiar to some of you, but with some differences, given the circumstances that change from one year to the next. So, first, to outline the situation where the organization is as a governmental entity. CentralHealth is not a granting or an appropriating agency. It's not like a legislative body that grants funds or a non-governmental organization that grants funds or appropriates funds. And what CentralHealth is a separate political subdivision that has a statutory obligation, which we fulfill through reimbursements for services through contracts, affiliation agreements, procurement, strategic investments, and more recently, the direct provision of care. The board, ultimately, the strategic direction that's going to be discussed today and the subsequent budget that gets adopted is the means to the end to be able to engage in contracts, affiliation agreements, et cetera, or direct provision of care in order to bring about health care. Now, what's different for FY24? First, we have a different roadmap that you're going to hear about today than prior fiscal years. It's much more sophisticated and intricate because we need to be very precise on how we address disease disparities and filling gaps in care, rather than linking together a series of ideas or concepts. So what we're talking about today all goes back to February of 2022, when the Board of Managers adopted the Health Equity Plan to address gaps in care that were based on the first ever community needs assessment, which was very empirical and analytically heavy, but then equally important voices of the community, which were firsthand accounts of patient needs. Now, I'll pause there to
So, Mike, what I'm hearing you saying is that, first of all, if we get requests for, I'm just making it up, $10 million from any entity out there that wants us to do something that they feel is within our realm, we're not an entity that can just grant that to them. We have to provide some sort, there has to be a contract. There has to be something that we are providing for them that deals with our population and that we are reimbursed for. Is that what I'm hearing?
More or less, yes, sir.
Okay. And then what's different between this year and previous years is that we never really had a roadmap. We were actually coming up with ideas that we thought, generated by smart people, but not necessarily comprehensively looked at, and definitely not talked about with the community that we served. And that's the difference in this plan versus many of the initiatives that we have outlined in the past. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other comments? Manager Jones, I'm sorry.
Yes, I guess my question is that as we look at preparing for 2024, inculcated in terms of what we have done, you said we don't contract with folks, but
We
actually
do contract.
We do contract.
we do contract with folks. So we have, within our enterprise, we have agencies that are doing things on our behalf.
Mm-hmm.
So are those part of our overall equity plan? Is that built into the overall picture of what we're doing? Or when we talk about CentralHealth, we're talking about the entity and not necessarily the enterprise separate from these other ones?
Yes, sir. My comments today and what I've made so far and what I have remaining are around really CentralHealth's budgeting, CentralHealth's strategic direction setting and related budgeting exercises proper. Now, coming back to your question, I think what you'll hear later today is, with the exception of some discussion around Sendero, but how we are utilizing our enterprise, working with enterprise partners, both those that are part of the enterprise, but then also not part of the enterprise, but still an integral partner. So, for example, Integral Care. So you'll see those pulled into what we're doing here as part of this overall effort, because while there's a lot that we are starting to do ourselves, there's always going to be a need for partners because there's only so much that we can do.
I would just, going forth, I think it would be helpful for us, for the public and for, at least for me as a board member, that we understand that dynamic there.
Yes, and just as we sit here and have this discussion, I know people are making some mental notes that as they prepare to come present to you today, that they need to draw those distinctions and clarifications.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
So proceeding, there's some key understandings, and I'm going to talk about this at a very high level about the tax rate and the budget process. And I'll say this as a disclaimer. As you all make motions and take certain parliamentary actions, always look at the chair, always look at the council to make sure that you're working appropriately through this process. So there's a lot more details to the process. So again, I'm just going to hit it at a very high level. First, staff is preparing a proposed budget based on the strategic priorities that are going to be discussed today, and all of this stemming from February of 2022, and the predetermined tax rate over the no new revenue based on the financial projections, which you all saw last week. So what you're going to hear today is the basis for what you will see in the form of a proposed budget next week. Now, let's talk about what today's basis discussion, if we can call it that, and the subsequent budget is and is not. It is a comprehensive product of a very intense adherence to the healthcare equity plan adopted by the board. It is a very functional budget, and it considers timing over a number of years and staging to ensure building blocks are in place. And it is fiscally realistic, and it meets the needs to fund ongoing care, cost of labor to acquire and retain talent to execute, and address gaps in care through new initiatives. What it's not is it's not a pick and choose structure with a zero-sum effect. In other words, you have these modular programs that can be inserted or removed, or you have dollar amounts that can be adjusted up and down without having any other effects across the board or lines of care. You can't just pull something out or modify something, and there's not going to be impacts throughout all the different foundational and enabling type exercises. Now, it's a board prerogative, not staff, but board, that this is not description of what the budget is. It doesn't preclude board members from amending or taking any other lawful or careful action to the budget that makes it a budget of the board. And so another way of saying this, perhaps it's not a pick and choose type structure, but it is a process of reallocations and impacts.
So the budget you're going to give us, Mike, is one that it's taken into consideration that there are initiatives that have started, there are initiatives that we will start, and all of those are sort of built into that budget so that it's functional and it continues across the fiscal years.
Yes.
And so, in essence, when we would want to reallocate something, if we see something that we would want to reallocate, we have to understand what impact that is going to make on an initiative that may have been started earlier. And as we move forward, that impact may mean that either there's less services or limited services based on our reallocation if we decide to do that.
Or stretched out over a different timeline. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Sure. Manager Kitchen.
Yeah, I think that is very useful and sort of fundamental for any budget. And it's fundamental for any budget. I mean, budget's really about, priorities. And to the extent that something is presented to the board wants to adjust priorities, we have to do that in the context of reallocation.
Right.
So I think that's pretty fundamental.
Okay. Manager Jones.
And it's something that we can do, and it's also something that I would say I would not want to pick and choose myself.
No.
If there was something that I thought that perhaps I had a question that I wanted to be a higher priority, my question would be to the staff to say, tell me what my options might be if I wanted to raise the priority, either in amount or timeline or something else like that. But I would rely on staff. I don't want to be in a position to sort of look through the budget and try to figure that out myself.
Great. Manager Jones?
I just want to make sure that when we set priorities over multiple fiscal years, we start inertia, activities, program measurements, evaluations of things. If we are to each year change those, then the question is, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of what we start if every year we're subject to change, pick and choose? So somehow or the other, I think we have to have some way to measure longevity in terms of new initiatives.
Yes, sir.
And prioritize those. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because once we start something, we expect it to be successful, I would think. And then if we change it, then the likelihood of being successful is not going to be it.
Yes, sir. And then I think you're setting the organization up, and therefore the patients, to just kind of launch from one fiscal year to the next, trying to hit an outcome.
Right.
And not maybe even knowing how to get there. Because you don't have the necessary intelligence to know, is this directionally speaking in the cadence the right way we need to be going? Point well taken. And that's the sort of, and you'll see this in today's strategic discussions around, that's exactly what the work groups did, was to put this together so that it had that continuity and integrity of execution, so that you could get to a measurable state and understand why something was working, not just have it accidentally work and be mystified but pleasantly surprised. Yeah.
And then the only thing I'd add, Mike, is that based on what Shannon said, is that in some ways we can put things out there, and probably not the best word, but as a pilot. to understand effectively whether it really will work, and if it does, then we expand it. If it doesn't, then we look for something different.
Right, but we have to give it enough time to
Oh,
evaluate
yeah.
before we
Yeah.
determine it's
Exactly.
at a pilot. Yeah, I would agree with you. Yes.
Manager Kitchen.
Oh, one other thing, so my understanding is we're not talking about the budget today, we're talking about the new initiatives proposed through this health equity plan.
Yes.
That's not everything that we're doing.
That's correct. This is the basis of the healthcare delivery, where we get into the operational and financial sustainability planning, today's discussion. And so we're going to be asking you all to ratify something so that we have a basis to then come back to you with a budget. But we're not going to get into line item budgets today.
Well, what we're talking about today doesn't even cover the whole scope of
That's
our
correct,
services.
yes.
Pardon?
That's correct. We're talking about.
Okay, yeah, I
healthcare
just want to be
equity
sure that that's clear to people.
plan.
Did I see you? Manager Martin.
Thank you. I'd like to suggest that if there is a proposal for a change, a new initiative, for example, that the board direct our administration to assess its value and its direction in terms of the roadmap we're on, and then deliver that to us to see before we start, because we'll get pulled all sorts of ways. That's all.
Agreed, and I think Mike will touch on that a little bit later in his remarks.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Mike.
So to continue with the process refresher, so based on today's actions, we'll finish building out a budget, and this is currently a draft staff level document that's being revised as we speak, and we'll present that budget in an open meeting. And to Manager Kitchen's point, it's going to encompass everything, if you will. And so now at that point, the committee or the board chair, whichever venue it's presented in this case, it's set for a board meeting, the chair accepts motions to move that proposed budget for consideration. At that point, it triggers a transition from being a staff proposed document to something that is clearly within the possession of the board and is therefore a formal matter of consideration by the board. And so that's really important to understand that, because there's only 9 people in this county that have the privilege of being able to take a document like that with such an impact in the community and then begin to deliberate on it. So I don't want that moment to be lost on us. And so once the board has possession of the budget under formal consideration, the board has the exclusive and the ultimate authority to either amend, consider, adopt, or not the budget or the tax rate. And these actions are done by motion and majority, and so that can include directions to staff or changes to the document itself. And so, for instance, if Dr. Martin wants to see an increase in the funding for nephrology, then it would be, I want to take a strategic redirection here on this, and I want to change the funding on this. A majority of the board would need to either say, yes, let's change that document, or staff, to your point earlier, we want you to go back and do an impact statement to see if we change nephrology but we move something else, what's the impact here? And so you can instruct staff to come back with more information, or you can amend the document itself. But again, that's a prerogative of the board. Now, there are some exceptions to this. As you all know, the Travis County Commissioners Court, by a majority, has to adopt the budget and the tax rate. But outside of that, the rest of this, once you take possession, the budget is yours. So along the way, there's going to be formal public hearings. I'm not going to go into that in detail that are required by law, but also what we enjoy doing. And in addition to the public hearings, we have community conversations to help build out the public awareness of the budget process. Now, as far as, I think, just jumping ahead to Dr. Martin, what you had talked about, getting subject matter experts and staff to get a full assessment on funding and impact, and I'll speak to that. So as a guiding principle, as part of the process, we need to ensure that the board has all the information necessary to make an informed decision, and equally important that the public is fully aware of all the rationale and some of the discussion that went into this, even if they're not watching these meetings or go back and look at the minutes, we want to be transparent about this and say, here's the thought processes. So it's really got a dual purpose there, informing the board, but also the public. Now, this principle is relevant now because in the past, we've always had requests, some generated by board members, some generated outside the board, but nonetheless, it culminates in coming to the board because you all now have possession of this budget document. And there's some key points here is that staff, are on standby, and since we're in fifth gear budget mode right now, it's really efficient to bring these to us for the board to instruct staff. We want you to look at this, and so that we can process it, come back, and provide that type of assessment. In fact, the kind of the working title that I have here is impact assessment. Just borrowing your words too, but it just so happens it kind of lines up with what we were talking about. And so we would provide some type of an assessment. Could be a simple verbal report to the board. It's not going to be a 30-page document or a huge PDF file because I think time is of the essence, but we'll make sure that you all are fully informed and we can answer some questions. But we would also recommend that there be board sponsors. And so if there is going to be an item that, because the board now has possession of the budget, that you all have sponsors that are sponsoring an amendment, obviously, not just, and it goes beyond just making a motion to amend. It really is ensuring that all the things that we're doing to properly assess this are actually, it may be a quick phone call with a staff person or two, but that's one approach here to make sure that the board is actively engaged. And then we come back and we provide these assessments to you. Again, they can be verbal, but then it becomes a matter of record because it's either in the minutes or it's on the video or it's in the budget resolution, or if the board should decide to move forward with a vote without having some type of discussion around what's the impact assessment, then that is also a matter of record. Like we just choose as a matter of board to do this, but then it's on record that there's a level of risk analysis perhaps that didn't go into this decision. And so the organization is aware of what it really needs to be paying attention to in the future. So to elaborate, staff, we would assess this from all different aspects. Legal, working with Travis County Attorney's Office and other councils as necessary. Look at it with respect to the healthcare equity plan. And is this working to achieve filling those gaps in healthcare and eliminating those disease disparities and inequities? We would look at it from a fiscal standpoint. Looking at it on, what are the other funding sources that are out there? There's federal and state and other local funding sources that could be available to address a particular problem, but knowing what the full fiscal landscape is, you can see the size of the pie is important. So there's a myriad of things that we would look at. It wouldn't just be a straight up legal or fiscal type analysis. The other thing that the staff, what we're not going to do is just stand up and say this is good or bad. That's not our role. Our role is to objectively evaluate and provide these impact assessments to the board so that you all can decide ultimately is this in line or not. The board sponsor, again, just, having a board member engaged, not unlike what you see at the county commissioner's court when a commissioner sponsors a particular item on an agenda. And then, of course, the impact assessments, which you've already talked about. So that's the essence of what the process would be when requests are coming in. But I'll pause there for a moment.
Any questions or clarifications? You can go ahead, Mike.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sure there's a list of dates somewhere.
A list of,
The dates are posted, right?
yes, and there's a backup item in the presentations that show what the timeline is, and then we've got calendar invites and then public postings as necessary. And then the comms and marketing shop, they do broadcast out too as well, let people know.
Thank you.
So there's another important too, and just a couple of more points, members, and I'll conclude these preface remarks. There is an important tool that you have as a board member. So let's just say that, and I've just given it a name, and it's time marking for future fiscal years. You can't bind future boards by saying we're going to allocate these funds in fiscal year 25 and 26. You can only decide one fiscal year at a time. However, what you can do, if there's not enough time to perform a proper analysis or an assessment, and I understand this can be difficult politically, but it's essential if we're going to eliminate the disease disparities in accordance with this plan, and that is go to whomever it is that is the source of the request, if you will, or the idea. Say, you know what, it's not yet. It's not no, but it's not yet either. It's not yet. And that's because we need an opportunity over the next fiscal year to sit down and have some conversations, understand. But we're going to mark this, and it's not just an idea that one person says to another. You can actually, you can make note of this in the budget resolution. You all have done that in prior fiscal years where you've instructed staff over the next fiscal year, we want you to look at A, B, and C and come back and talk to us about it. And you can do that. And so that's an important tool for you all as board members when you just simply don't have enough information to make a decision one way or the other about this current fiscal year's funding or tax rate. And lastly, and to conclude, I do need to point out, and we talk about this, we've talked about this in prior years, about policy CMP 010P, and this is Code of Conducts and Ethics for board members. And Mackenzie's here today, and I might, if there's some questions, I'm going to lay out a couple of points, but any difficult questions, I might put Mackenzie on the spot and ask him to come up and answer them. But there's really two relevant sections here I need to bring up for today. One is Section 9, the other is Section 10. So Section 9, and I'm picking out a specific piece of this, members, full disclosure. A board member's fiduciary duty to CentralHealth precludes a board member from appearing before the CentralHealth board or lobbying CentralHealth staff as an advocate for CentralHealth funding to outside persons, groups, or interest. Pertinent part of Section 10, requests from board members not expressed during a board or committee meeting. So think anything you do outside of this room. Carrying on to the next relevant section here in portion in Section 10, board members shall be respectful of CentralHealth staff time and duties and avoid unduly burdensome and or unreasonably repetitive requests. Requests for staff time or resources shall not be unreasonably withheld. So let me put those two together and try to paint a picture for you in terms of what the policy is. Board members can make motion, you can explain, you can and should vigorously debate. That helps us as staff understanding what your ultimate direction is going to be and where you're coming from and giving us context. But there is a line where it turns into trying to politically influence the votes of others. Or in the case of maybe going to staff and saying, I need this plugged in, and the rest of the board members don't know about it. So it's trying to address that situation right there. I don't think it would be reasonable. In fact, it would be unreasonable. You all will not be able to do what you need to do as board members if all you could do is just make a motion and then zip it and not say anything. You have to be able to explain why you're doing this, the rationale. You all have lines of sight and lived experiences and perspectives that you need to put on the table. I mean, that's what makes a great board of managers a great board of managers, because you can have those kind of discussions. But there is a point at which it does cross a line into lobbying, and I think if you're ever wondering, what that is, we could deliberate that all day long. But I think circle back around with Mackenzie or counsel and have a discussion about this if it's not clear to you. But I just try to take a really simple rule of thumb and suggest to you that just consider whether or not you are politically influencing the votes of your other members that are on the board in a way that is happening outside of this boardroom right here.
I'm understanding what you're saying.
Okay. Well, let me talk about 10 real quickly, and then we'll come back to that provision if you don't mind. So as far as, and again, we're still talking about policy CMP 010P. If you're making all of your motions and you're having all of your deliberations here, as you should, because it's a quorum of the Board of Managers, that's safe harbor, if you will. But if there is an instance where, and you feel like that either from a strategic direction or a budget standpoint, you want to come outside the Board of Managers and you want to go to staff and say, I need to see this done. My instruction to staff will be, okay, we need to get that back in front of the full board so that all the board has the opportunity to debate and deliberate it and see it. So that's how the staff piece, in terms of how I was going to handle any situations. so far nothing's happened to date. I don't anticipate it. We have in the past from time to time had to circle back around with managers and say, well, that's a great idea, but you really need to get that in front of the full board, let the full board deliberate it. So let's come back, Manager Kitchen, to your question. I'm going to see if I can explain this a little bit differently, but let me read the pertinent policy again, just because hopefully others will hear this and maybe have some comments. A board member's fiduciary duty to Central Health precludes a board member from appearing before the Central Health Board or lobbying Central Health staff. Now that's fairly straightforward, the staff part. But it's appear before the Central Health Board as an advocate for Central Health funding to outside persons, groups, or interests. Okay.
I heard that part. I understood that part.
Okay. So, help me understand that piece of it in terms of where maybe the disconnect is and what I'm trying to convey to the board.
Oh, well, no, that's a conflict of interest to do that kind of lobbying, so I understand that. And it was what you were talking about afterwards. It was what you were talking about afterwards that I couldn't quite catch what you were saying.
Right. So,
Maybe it was that other provision that I wasn't quite catching.
and I hope that I'm not overly complicating this, and if I am, forgive me, and I'll stand down, please. But if I was trying to think about the provision here that says from appearing before the Central Health Board as an advocate for Central Health funding to outside persons, groups, or interests. And so you're absolutely right. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't, be a declared lobbyist, if
Right.
you will, for another entity or group, and then come in and say, "Hey, I'm lobbying for this." Mm-hmm. That's obvious. But this particular policy, it doesn't just stop at paid or contracted or gratis lobbying type contractual arrangements, and it does suggest, and this is just what I'm saying as a general rule of thumb, that if you're wondering, am I lobbying the Central Health Board? Well, if you're using a tool of political influence, let's just say, so you go to another elected official or officials to try to get a Central Health Board of manager to change their vote, and you don't let the manager's vote be their vote, then I'm suggesting that is also another potential form of lobbying. And so I'm just trying to cover the basis on this because it doesn't really define, lobbying with a capital L, like the Texas Ethics Commission and related codes do. So I'm just trying to put some perspective on this.
I get.
But having said that, there's nothing that precludes. In fact, this is absolutely necessary to a healthy organization to be able to put things out there, explain them, vigorously debate them, etc. That's not lobbying. That's being a board member.
Manager Kitchen?
Yeah, here's what I'm reacting to. And I don't think you're saying this. I'm just saying that, as board members, we certainly have a responsibility to talk to each other.
Right.
And to, and part of that includes influencing each other on a particular vote. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with us talking to each other and trying to influence each other. Now, obviously, you have to be careful about quorum issues, under the law, but there's nothing wrong with that. And there's also nothing wrong with talking to members in the community about what they're interested in, and if that's something that something I agreed with as a board member, I could certainly bring that to my fellow board members, and suggest that it might be something we want to do. So I'm not getting that. I really think that perhaps what you're saying is overthinking this, and as a board member, I absolutely have the right to lobby my fellow board members, as long as I do it within the construct of quorum. So I don't see that as an issue. What I think you're doing, and I appreciate it, is making us aware, which is really important for us to be aware of what these rules are. I'm just saying that I think, that one I'm not quite sure of. I think I don't see I'm not aware of any kind of inappropriate action that a board member could take in that area, and I may just not be thinking about things. So,
And I can't give a specific example, but
Yeah.
I'll put David on the spot to say that I woke him up. We were having a conversation, and it wasn't a quorum that was outside in the lobby, but we were sort of talking about where we thought certain board members stood with regard to votes. And I
Okay.
think David had a problem with that.
Just a caution more than a problem. I'm not saying it was a problem. It's just, once you head down that path and going to, yes, you can do sub-quorum discussions. If you're thinking about those two things at the same time, there's the possibility that you could vote a line, that you could vote trade, things like that. And that's where you start getting in trouble, because you're not just going to do it with one person. You're going to do it with the next person too. And that's how San Antonio School District got in trouble in
well, you can't do a walking
1987.
quorum. Yeah,
So,
yeah. Where I tell somebody else what somebody else told me, and then they
Right.
tells me, that's a walking quorum. Yeah. So yeah, I get that.
Okay. That was I don't know if that's what Mike was trying to say, but that's what I heard, is that we can't do that.
Yeah, no, I agree.
All right, but we can surely talk with each other sub-quorum and understand where you stand, maybe understand where I stand. If they're alike, great. If there's not, then there's not, because it's going to be the basis of the entire vote of the majority of the board that's
Right.
going to make it go. Okay,
Right.
is that
Yeah,
sort of
and
clarifying?
that includes, I can certainly, if there's a community group that has come to me and suggested something, I can certainly bring that to the attention of other board members.
And of the entire board,
Yeah.
to be honest with you.
And I can certainly advocate for that position if I want to.
Exactly.
So, okay.
Okay.
I think we're on the same page. I just want,
Well, I'm reading the policy. I was reading the policy at face value, and ultimately, these are discussions that you'll need to have with council and compliance on these things, rather than myself. But just one final comment. I will give you an example of something that could happen, hypothetically. If in your discussions with each other, whether it's in this meeting or perhaps one-on-one, one member is not getting the traction that they would like to have with that member, and politically influencing the vote of that member would be going to the appointing body, be it the city or the county, and suggesting that that member's tenure on this board might be limited, or terms of reappointment, that is, if you don't go along with this particular position. So that's the sort of thing that I'm referring to. So in other words, let the members vote, be their vote. And again, except that there might be some overthinking here, but I just didn't want to start this process off without referring back to this policy, given that it spoke specifically to lobbying and advocacy. That's all. Thank you.
Any questions?
oh, well, no, no.
Okay. Manager John?
I've heard a lot here in this discussion that can be somewhat very, very cautious, and I respect it, having served on this about, I guess, almost 6 years now. Some of this is a little different than my understanding, but what I understand basically is, as board members, we have the opportunity within the framework of our participation is to advocate for those things that we want and we support, and the community the community organizations and others who approach us. What we don't have is the responsibility of trying to mitigate or bring pressure on individual board members or multiple board members by intimidation, by going to other appointing boards and saying so-and-so is not supportive of that. Is what I understood from this.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's true.
Well, that would That would fall into the bad behavior category, I think. I'm sorry.
No, it's true. Maybe it has happened, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, I don't know if it's happened.
But I understand.
It could.
It's on record, it
Yeah.
shouldn't happen. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Giesa.
With that, I'll turn it over to Monica.
Thank you, Chair Bell. Monica Crowley, Central Health, and thank you all for being here today for this special called board meeting. I know you have many meetings ahead during this budget season, and we appreciate your thoughtful guidance, your active participation, and your leadership as Central Health has been working on developing this healthcare equity plan and healthcare equity operational and financial sustainability implementation plan over the past 2 years with our community members, patients, stakeholders, data analysts, subject matter experts, and partners to develop this operational and financial sustainability implementation plan. Doing this work, including beginning to implement this work, is the work of Central Health. It is not the work of any other organization in our community. And taking this systematic approach and developing a comprehensive plan to a comprehensive multi-year plan, we have been supported by the board, asked by the board to do this for the first time over the past 2 years. And we are all grateful for having this opportunity to develop this comprehensive plan so that we really can impact the lives of those we serve and make their healthcare better. There are so many of our colleagues that have participated in this work developing the plans over the last couple of years that we can't recognize them all, but I do want to recognize Drew Kolarczyk, Anissa Kendall, former Central Health staffer Lisa Owens, and Kim Johnston for their tireless work in developing this plan over many weeks, months, and hours. I'm going to hand off this presentation to Dr. Abhi Sharma and Danielle Srinivasan, and after the presentation, we will be recommending that you take action to ratify the plan and direct staff to implement it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So like Mike mentioned, he talked a lot about guiding principles, and we've acknowledged and used a lot of those guiding principles throughout the process that we've followed over the last 2 years. What we wanted to focus on today are 3 things. The first one is we wanted to give a quick update on where we are. 2, we wanted to focus on the process that has got us here. And 3 is the most important thing we want to cover today. It's the outputs that have come out of that process. So when I talk about outputs, there are 2 things. The first one is the what needs to be done, which would be shared with you in the form of some highlights from our implementation roadmap. And then the second thing is the cost of doing that. So we worked with Jeff, Monica, and the team to delve deeper into what are some of the capabilities that are required to do what we need to do, and then we've expensed those out over a 7-year period to show how much all of that would cost. So again, an update on where we are, how we got here, and what were some of the key outputs. We want to spend some time on next steps, and we will leave time at the end for questions. Next slide, please. So we wanted to start off with a high-level summary of where we are right now. We began the first phase of this work 2 years ago. That phase focused on what we need to do. Now, how we got to that was we started looking at the needs that exist in the community, and we did that through the Community Health Needs Assessment Survey, and that was the starting point of our engagement. So understanding what's really required in the community. That then translated to what would actually help us meet those community needs. And we started thinking about what were the key strategic imperatives that we needed to focus on in order to do that. Now, the resulting product there was the strategic plan. Now, that was the first phase of our work. We used the contents of that strategic plan to think about how we actually execute on what we need to do. Now, when we started thinking about that, we again started with the community needs. We wanted to make sure that we assessed those needs, but also looked at those needs from the point of view of where the scope and scale of those needs was the highest, and we started thinking about how we prioritize those needs. Now, in order to meet those needs, we needed to do something. Now, that something was described in the form of initiatives and projects. So the initiatives were actual executionable plans that would allow us to meet those needs. Now, as you can imagine, there were a lot of needs in the community, and what came out of those needs were 150 individual standalone projects that were then consolidated and bucketed into 38 initiatives. All of those were synergistic, they were dependent, and the sequencing and prioritization of those initiatives and projects was extremely important. Now, the culmination of all of this work is the operational implementation plan and the operational roadmap. Now, what goes underneath that is the fiscal capacity and the costs that would be required to meet the prerogatives in that operational implementation plan, and that is what the end product here would be. As you can imagine, we are where that red star is. Now, we've achieved a lot till date. Like I mentioned, we started with the community needs. We then identified initiatives and projects. We put those projects on a timeline, clearly showing the dependencies and synergies that resulted in the operational roadmap. And we also looked at the financial models that would allow us to bounce the fiscal capacity of CentralHealth with the financial needs of executing on those operational roadmaps. We are continuing to work on the oversight and governance models because I think all of us realize that our approach is based on the system of care model, and there will be constituents and stakeholders whose cooperation and involvement would be required to execute on this plan, and showcasing how the governance model works and what the accountability standards are is extremely important. So right now we are working on creating those governance models as well as accountability plans. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, our goal since the outset has been to create a system of care model. And what you see here is a high-performing safety net health system and what some of the key capabilities and services that make up that model are. Now, the two things that I want to highlight here is that there are a lot of moving parts here, so it's a very complex operating model. And the second thing is that all of these need to work in cohesion with one another. So if you look at this slide here, the blue cogs towards the outside are indicative of the healthcare services that are required to meet needs of the community in a safety net population. And right at the center are those enabling services that make all of these work together and in cohesion with one another. Again, our goal is to make sure that we gradually transition over to this model where the disparate parts here are connected with one another and work in cohesion. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at what was shared on the previous slide and we think about how we actually get there, these are some of the things that we have been able to do over the last 2 years to make sure that we are moving closer to our goal. Now, the first thing that we need to do here is to, again, understand that we have to focus on the patients and our communities. So I want to bring your attention to the community needs part of this pie diagram and start from there. So the first thing that we do, again, is identify community needs. Now, once we identify those needs, like I mentioned, we need to identify projects that would help us to meet those needs. Now, this is a very detail-oriented exercise. And like I mentioned, we identified 150 individual projects that would be required to meet the community needs. Now, when we started thinking about those projects, we quickly saw that there were projects that were dependent on one another, there were projects where synergies existed, and there were also projects that needed to be sequenced in a particular way for the execution of those projects to be effective. And that helped us translate these projects into initiatives. So when you think about initiatives, it's a list of projects that are dependent on one another that need to be sequenced and thought of as one cohesive unit that would then allow us to meet the needs that exist in the community. So again, we began with needs, identified projects, and then translated those to initiatives. Now, the difference between projects and initiatives was projects were more conceptual in nature, but when we thought about initiatives, we quickly translated projects to operational blocks, building blocks that would then allow us to move to the next step. So the next step here was the operational roadmaps. How do these initiatives tie with one another? What initiatives need to be sequenced in what way? And what are some of the synergies that would allow us to make a more efficient system of care was what was front and center when we thought about operational roadmaps. For these operational roadmaps, a lot of capabilities needed to be built. And each of those capabilities was then used to translate into actual dollar figures that would be required to stand those capabilities up. And that's when we moved from operational roadmaps to identifying the inputs in the financial model, and the eventual output here was the financial model that we created and the outputs that we will share with you towards the end of this deck. Now, where we are right now is where that red star was, and this goes into the detail of that. So like I mentioned, we want to create an efficient system of care. There will be multiple stakeholders who would be involved in the execution of these initiatives, and we want to make sure that not only performance is being tracked, but also that governance and accountability standards and escalation pathways are also set up in a way that is inclusive and effective. And that's what we are focusing on right now. It's ensuring that implementation and performance tracking is going to be effective once we start executing on these initiatives. Next slide, please. So I'll not belabor the point again, but again, this slide just talks about where we started. We started with our communities. We started with our patients, and that drove each and every step that followed. Next slide, please. So once we started looking at community needs, we wanted to make sure that we not only stay focused on the conceptual needs that exist in the community, but also translate those conceptual needs into actionable buckets that would then be used to identify initiatives and move towards operationalization of those initiatives. So we bucketed those community needs into 3 categories that you see here. The first one was primary care. Within primary care, we identified needs along 3 dimensions. The first one was primary care that included timely access to services and building capacity. The second one was wellness and prevention, and the third one was urgent and convenient care, which also included same-day access. The second bucket that we identified was needs within the specialty care, behavioral, and dental area of expertise. The first one here was specialty care, the second was behavioral, and the third was dental. And the fourth one was acute services that included hospital-based care as well as post-acute care. Now, just to orient the group to what the colors underneath each of these areas means, we started to think about what percentage of current community need is being met. Now, based on how much of that need was being met, we categorized these needs into significant gaps existing within that area, which meant that less than 50% of those needs were being met. The second level was moderate, which means within those areas, 50 to 70% of that need was being met. And then the last one was minimal gaps, which meant that more than 70% of community needs were being met. And what you can see here is that specialty care, dental, hospital, and post-acute were areas where significant needs existed. Now, this does not mean that we are not going to look at the other areas. It just means that on a relative scale, the needs that exist within these four categories were relatively higher. Next slide, please. Now, once we had identified what these needs were and what the scale and magnitude of these needs were, the next step again was for us to identify projects that would enable us to meet the needs that existed in the community. Now, once those projects were identified, we bucketed those projects based on where dependencies existed, where synergies existed, and how those were sequenced relative to one another to draft a list of initiatives that would then take us from the conceptual to the operational. Now, like I mentioned, we started with 150 projects. Those were bucketed into 38 standalone initiatives. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned, we started with the patient and our communities at the heart of this analysis. Now, it was extremely important for us to not only think about initiatives from an operational or strategic point of view, but also think about how the lives of our patients would change once those initiatives were operationalized. And we did that through an exercise that focused on each step that made up the patient journey and how the experience of that patient would change at each of those steps. And the product here were patient journey maps, which again are extremely important for us when we go to the community, because we need to tell the community and community stakeholders about how the patient would be experiencing the system in a different and better way moving forward, and what are some of the benefits that our operational plans would then create for the patient. Next slide, please. And all of this is again centered around better access, better experience, and better quality of care. How we did that was, again, we engaged patients, we engaged community groups, as well as stakeholders who were going to participate in the actual delivery of care to ensure that we had a 360-degree view of what each constituent is expecting and how we can make sure that we get as close as possible to what they were expecting. It was an inclusive exercise where we brought in a lot of stakeholders to make sure that we were listening to them and we were hearing what some of their needs were, what some of their expectations were, so that what we created at the end was, again, a 360-degree picture of where needs existed and how we would go about meeting those needs in a very effective way. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about translating needs into initiatives and then how those initiatives tied to one another, that was done through rounds of discussions and consistent data analysis that helped us refine the outputs of our work over the period of time. Now, the key considerations that we need to think about as we think about the operational roadmap and how that get executed is that there is need in the community, and the need is spread across almost every single area of care delivery. And we need to be extremely careful about what we go after first, because as we know, there is this need for us to do a lot, but our fiscal capacity will put constraints on what we can do. So again, trade-offs and focusing on things that meet the most needs in the community is going to be critical. Now, the second thing that we need to think about is how do we leverage our resources in an optimal way? And we think about resources, they have to be resources that are held within CentralHealth, but also resources that are held within our partner organizations. So how do we make sure that our partners are playing to the best of their abilities and that their capabilities are used the way they should be used, given the fact that we cannot hope to move the needle 100% on every single thing, and we would gradually have to wean off certain areas of expertise that we depend on our partners for. The third thing is, this is an ongoing process. This will continue with discussions. We will get data. We will get information on performance standards and on performance of our different stakeholders, as well as how our patients are benefiting from these initiatives. And we need to make sure that those inputs are integrated and our operational plans and goals are refined as data comes in and as we learn more about what's working and what's not. And to the point that was discussed early on, pilots might be one of the ways that we do that. Now, pilots might not be suitable for every single area because there are certain areas where there is significant needs, areas that we need to go after no matter what, but there would be certain areas that are more amenable to pilots where we would use pilots to make sure that the process is iterative and that refinements are being consistently made. Now, as we think about the scope of what we need to do, again, balancing fiscal capacity with financial need for these initiatives is going to be critical, and that is the last point on this slide. We need to make sure that we are agile in our approach, and as and when we learn about things that are not working the way we expect them to, we are nimble and that we can make changes to make sure that the right things get prioritized and that funding is allocated to the right areas as we make sure that the needs in the community are met in the way that they should be. Danielle, I'll pass it to you. We are now going to transition over to the outputs, and Daniel's going to walk us through the initiatives and the outputs of our financial modeling exercise.
Thank you, Abby. So as Abby had mentioned earlier, grounding to all of what is to come is where the most critical health needs are for the patients that we serve, the safety net of Travis County. So when we think about those significant gaps in care today, we know that there are patients that are not receiving the care that they need to live a quality life, or the right care at the right place at the right time. So we know that they're going without, and our vision is to really bridge that gap so that our safety net patients can really live a fulfilling quality life, and that healthcare is less of a challenge for them. So when we think about these primary areas of needs, it extends across primary care and wellness, specialty care, behavioral and dental, and hospital-based and post-acute services. So when you look at these specific projects, where there are over 150 projects that will be presented later on in this deck, they've all been designed to address these gaps that exist today in our community for these patients. Next slide, please. So using those gaps and how we determine those was on a very comprehensive data-driven approach, as well as meeting with patients themselves and the voice of the community. We really were able to hone in and identify 13 prioritized community needs, as well as what are those foundational enablers that will drive a high-performing healthcare system for the safety net across Travis County. And then other important factors that were so important for consideration and were woven into this overall plan were understanding how we engage and enroll these patients, right, so that they have consistent access. And then looking at social determinants of health, because we know that social determinants of health and those factors influence how our patients are able to access and receive care. And we want to make sure that our future healthcare delivery system is built to recognize these challenges that exist today and some of the preferences that our patients have as they receive care, so that we continue to build trust across the community. Next slide, thank you. So what you're going to see on this slide and then the slide that follows is very consistent with what you have seen in the past. So we have designed 38 initiatives that extend across these significant needs. So these initiatives then are supported by specific projects. So through a very comprehensive analytical and qualitative approach, so looking again at the voice of the community and considering how our patients prefer to receive care, what are those projects that will drive the most impact? How do we structure our services and programs to engage with the safety net so that they are receiving the right care at the right place at the right time? So you will see here in the light blue shading across that these are the 38 initiatives that had been identified to have the most impact as we look to drive quality, equitable access to the safety net. And then these are the projects below that have been identified and are under development as we look to close the gaps in the most meaningful and impactful way. Next slide, please. This slide here are the non-clinical initiatives. So again, the foundational enablers and the social determinants of health and coverage programs. So when we think about what is going to drive success and provide the backbone to our vision, the foundational enablers, we know that care coordination is so important. We know that these patients often have difficulty navigating the healthcare delivery system, so care coordination is a critical component to this, as is a focused approach to enrollment and eligibility, information technology. So it's not just having the systems in place, but the ability to share information through interoperability, and then receiving that data in a timely way so that we can make an impact and change when needed. And then also pharmacy. Next slide, please. So this is a lot of information on one slide, and we're not going to go bullet by bullet, but really the intent of this slide and the slide that follows is to show you the breadth and depth of projects that have been delivered or developed by each initiative, so that you can see here that this is a very far-reaching plan that is intended to drive impact from all angles. Next slide, please. So again, extending across these 13 critical initiatives and looking at what are those projects that will drive the most impact. Next slide. And then these are the non-clinical initiatives. So you can see here, same breadth and depth, but a very thoughtful, data-driven approach as we look at deploying programs that will really reach these patients in the most meaningful way. Next slide. So this timeline is a timeline that you have seen in the past, but what you can see here is this represents the overall milestones in the project execution plan. So over a 7-year timeline, you can see how these initiatives will be rolled out, activated, and then continuing to be executed upon through monitoring. And you can see where we're building on our successes, right? So we're going to implement programs, get the successes on the books, and then continue to build on that great work. So a great example is the RZ clinic that's coming online here shortly, followed by Hancock under expanded access to specialty care. And you can see here that the way that this timeline has been developed has been very intentional. So we're being good stewards of our financial resources, of our human capital, and then other capital resources so that we are being efficient and effective as we roll out these programs. Next slide, please. So when we look at the phasing timeline over the 7-year period, what you'll see here is a gradual increase in the total operating expenses for these initiatives. So what these numbers represent is the incremental operating costs to implement the healthcare equity action plan. So this is not your operating budget overall for Central Health, but what is it going to take to bridge the gap for the gaps in healthcare equity today and to implement this high-performing healthcare equity system for safety net across Travis County. So we build upon our successes year over year, being good stewards of our resources, building our efficiencies, our competencies, and continuing to scale. Next slide, please. This is a detailed look at what are the incremental operating costs that are estimates to implement each of these initiatives. So year over year for the 7-year period, you're going to see a gradual increase as we implement, we become successful, and then we scale. I'd like to call your attention to healthcare for the homeless because you're not going to see a number here. The reason why is because we're leveraging our resources across primary care, across specialty care, across dental, across hospital, post-acute, et cetera. So we're leveraging our resources to drive care for the homeless population so that that is the reason why there is not a specific carve out there. And that is a very consistent theme when you look at the overall plan. We've been very intentional so that our staff are multidisciplinary, cross-functional, and so that we can easily scale in the most efficient and sustainable way, knowing that we have limited resources. Next slide, please. This slide is a continuation from the prior slide, very consistent with what you have seen in the past. This shows you the non-clinical initiatives, and then at the very bottom, the estimated capital expenditures that will also be required to successfully execute and implement. So over the 7-year time period, a cumulative cost of about $811 million. When we look at this forecast, what's so important to recognize is that the investment in closing the gap in these critical health needs and building healthcare equity across Travis County's safety net is that we still have positive reserves. So this will require a 6.5 increase year over year. But when you look at the sources and the uses to close the gap, we still have sufficient reserves to continue to invest in the safety net for Travis County. Next slide, please. So when we think about the path ahead and what's going to make us so successful, we really need to consider the critical success factors, right? So when we think about being a strategy-focused organization, it's continuing with our vision and keeping the path forward that we are going to close the gap on these critical health needs and holding true to the strategy that we will develop this high-performing healthcare system for the safety net. It's really assuring appropriate operational capacity and organizational structure. So do we have the right competencies in place? For example, information technology and interoperability across the system of care to assure that we're able to exchange data across our own sites and the sites of our partners. As Abby had mentioned previously, we're working on what those operational and reporting structures look like, and that will be the last phase of this work to be completed before implementation. Continuous engagement with our community and stakeholders is critical. This system was designed and community input was foundational to the overall design and overarching path of this high-performing healthcare delivery system of the future. It really has been tailored to meet the needs of Travis County's safety net. So when we think about what their needs are, we know that they're going to change over time. as our community continues to evolve, and it is critical that we continue to solicit their input on a regular basis so that we can continue to tailor our healthcare system for them. Looking at how we're performing on an operating basis. So how are we tracking our performance? It's really making sure that we have the right key performance indicators and that we're monitoring and tracking performance on a regular basis. What we've done is really considered what other high-performing safety net systems look at across the country, and then also tailored that with what is so unique about Travis County and the patients that you will be treating. And then sustainable community investment. So continued investment in the community through the taxes, and then also really assuring that that continues so that we continue to close the gaps. Next slide, please. So when we think about the path ahead, we are so close. So as Avi had mentioned, we've really completed quite a journey, but we know that a lot of work still lies ahead. So we are currently looking at and finalizing the design of the oversight models and reporting structures to really assure that we are positioned for a high-performing healthcare delivery system of the future, and that we are positioned to implement effectively and efficiently. And then also, we're finalizing the key performance indicators that will help us monitor and track our success. So we know that the road is not finished from the least, but for this work here, we're getting very, very close to implementation. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both. Great information, as usual. And I'd like to open it up to members who may have questions. So I'll start with Dr. Martin. Thank you, sir. Manager Kitchen.
Yes, I think we've mentioned before that this is incredible. It's really great to have a roadmap for the board, and there's been quite a bit of effort going into this. So I just want to say, I don't think we can say too many times how important this is for CentralHealth's future, I think, and for service for our members. So I have just a few quick questions. That's
sure.
Okay. First, I want to go back to something you said just to make sure I'm hearing it right. So the document that I think it's slide number 21, the one that has the estimate for the next 7 years, I think. So the line that speaks to healthcare for the homeless, I think you added, I think there's a note there that you just mentioned. So I just want to emphasize that line does not represent the only projects or initiatives, might be the better word, that are being pursued that relate to homeless folks. I think you mentioned that these other lines related to post-acute care, for example, and some of the other lines all include services for homelessness. So did I hear that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so one of those might be the respite program that we've talked about for quite some time is in one of the other lines and not in the healthcare for the homeless. Did I hear that right? Yeah. What line? It's the respite is in the post-acute, right? Okay. And then the diversion pilot that we've had some conversation about is also, or that concept of diversion is also captured here also, I believe, and that's, not sure what line that's in.
It's in the specialty care and primary
Specialty care.
Yeah, okay, exactly right.
Okay. And then there's some other things related to to healthcare for the homeless that's throughout here, so, okay. I just wanted to confirm that. And then I just have two questions. Sure. So, also I want to confirm that this slide here, it's contemplated that this slide addresses all of those projects, right?
Correct.
It's not a subset of the projects, it's all of the projects, okay.
So it's this in the following slide, 2 slides.
Yeah, that's right, 2 slides. Okay, and let me say thank you for the list of projects. It's very helpful to see all of those listed, so. Okay, and then my question is, so because we understand that these are new, this is sort of new in the sense that these identify projects that are new projects to meet unmet need. When you're developing the KPIs, what's the thinking about KPIs that relate to our sort of, I'll call them legacy services? Will those be part of the KPIs or no?
So for the KPIs, what we are essentially doing is we're looking at similar populations, and then we are identifying what the benchmark would be. Now, if those KPIs are already being tracked as part of legacy programs that are existing, we're going to look at those and see how the needle on those would be moved once these initiatives get executed. But there might be net new KPIs that are associated with programs that are not being run, and then we would not be benchmarking those, but we would be looking at a target that would be based on benchmarks and how closely and efficiently we progress towards those.
Okay, so if I'm hearing right, the process of using KPIs, which is basically monitoring how we're doing, applies across everything we're doing. We have some in place right now for legacy projects. So the effort here will focus on these new initiatives, but it'll be done in a way that integrates with what we might already have in place.
Yeah, wherever there's overlap. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so wherever there is overlap between existing KPIs and KPIs that would be associated with net new programs, we would be looking at how those move once these programs get implemented.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Manager Kitchen. Manager Motwani.
Of course, I echo the appreciation. It's always good to have such a consistent roadmap and to be able to allude to where we were, where we are. I frankly appreciate hearing it often because there's just a lot going on and it's super helpful for us to be able to come back and track. That being said, I think the discussions that preceded this a little bit, as well as some of this discussion that you all led, make me think a lot about what is the nature of the sort of elasticity of this roadmap, right? And how are we able to react to perhaps rapidly changing community conditions which may contradict the well-informed and well-intended strategy that is here? And going back to Manager Jones' comments, which I seem to really very much agree with, which is that, you know, we probably want to be ultra thoughtful and ultra intentional about making changes early on. We want to see what's working and make sure things have time to get off the ground. Now, that being said, let's say in year 3, let's say 3 fiscal years from now, you know, there is a community condition that seems to offer a strong mandate for adaptation of this roadmap. I am both impressed by the loftiness of this roadmap and the profundity of detail, which I think is inevitable. But that being said, you know, I get the feeling of a very complex, scaffolded and then built out Jenga, which if we pull something out and make a change and don't understand, I guess, for lack of a better adage, which other bone it may be I just feel like it may be complex. I know that it will be complex. I'm just daunted somewhat by that notion. And whether it's Dr. Bell or Mike or y'all, Dr. Srinivasan and Sharma, who may be able to kind of share some insight into what that could look like or how that would look or assuage that concern, great. But for me in the short term, what I think would be extremely important, and forgive if it's redundant, what I think would be important for me in the short term is objectives and key results tied literally to budget line items for at least the first 1 or 2 fiscal years. So FY24, each and every single one of these budget line items should have objectives and key results that we can look at to see if those objectives and key results are being hit in that fiscal year. And also if we are going to make an adaptation, we can get a sense for how far we're moving incrementally, as well as, of course, I mean, this is detailed and objectives and key results are really embedded all over the place here, but if we can get them in an incremental way tied to budget, I think that makes my interpretation of this a little bit easier.
Thank you, Manager Motlani. And having those key measures that we can track is, I think, a key point for, for you guys to monitor where we're going. And then to the point of as there are additional community needs that are identified or needs to adapt, other kind of, systemic changes that might cause us to need to adapt this plan. Really having those measures in place so that we could get to that impact analysis that I think Dr. Bell and Mr. Giesland were discussing before. And I think that is something that staff and our advisors will be prepared to do for you. I think one of the things that I do want to, come back to is that these aren't budgets. If you look at slide 21 and 22, it's a high level reflection of the magnitude of the work that needs to happen. And we will work with Guidehouse in the next couple of months to develop additional meaningful KPIs for the work that is overarching in the plan and for work that's particular to the fiscal year 2024 budget. As Danielle was affirming with Manager Kitchen, if you look at page 21 and 22, this is really just a reflection of the financial magnitude of the work, but it won't necessarily track to the budget. And an example I can give to that is funding that may be available for a diversion center pilot through an expansion of our contract with Integral Care would be reflected on page 21 in expanded access to specialty care because our overarching agreement with Integral Care is under specialty care because it's for crisis behavioral health services. So some of the things might, even though that primarily impacts people experiencing homelessness, it's not under healthcare for the homeless, it's under specialty care. And so I think as you move into next week and the coming weeks, looking at the fiscal year 2024 budget, we'll be able to get at what you're asking for from that budget standpoint. And then we will come back in October and November with these KPIs around the overarching program.
So if I'm hearing, thank you, and if I'm hearing that right, so what we're looking at here, reflects the magnitude or the expense, the potential expense of this work, but doesn't necessarily tie one-to-one back with expense categories as demarked on the budget, right? That's helpful, and it makes sense. And it's unfortunate that the world is as complicated as it is, but it is what it is. Now, that being said, I do think it would be helpful, if I can say this without being kicked, in as plain speak as possible, for each, if anything, of the initiatives that we'd be working on in each fiscal year, I guess perhaps even irrespective of budget, because we can reverse engineer that later, but just each year, like under SDOH, we're looking at, you know, what the initiatives are. But say if we look at the expense outlay as it's stated here, you know, over the next 7 fiscal years, it's a $12 million expense outlay, right? But for FY24, we know that it would be around $1 million. So in FY24, what would we expect to be completed? You know, we expect this to be completed, and we know that's completed because we expect X to be completed, and we know it's completed because we saw Y and Z as key results of that. And I think that's, you know, it simplifies things, but it's an orienting mechanism, I think, for us to be able to make decisions at the end of FY24 or even in FY25 around, if we're changing course here, we can go back and look and see what kind of incremental progress we may have been making, if that makes sense.
Mike?
If I may, I mean, there's, you know, within all of the machinations and what you see here today, there is plenty of utility that allows the board to be able to have that level of assessment. And so I'm not concerned, you know, just looking forward into the future that the information is not going to be there to answer the most basic of questions which you posed. I do think that the board needs to think, future boards need to think about your, not only your current committee structure, but also what your workflows look like and what the cadence needs to be. Because I think if you were to come back every month, for example, and say, okay, where are we on initiative number 128? It's not going to, it's the information is not going to flow like that. But I think having that, you know, discussion amongst yourselves to be deliberate about this is what we're setting up to be able to track those metrics and then to determine, do we need to turn on the agility switch because we're going to have to pivot on this because this current course is not working to get us to where we need to go. I think it's going to be important for future board.
Thanks. I think, yeah, as you all talk it through, it makes me kind of feel like it is covered. At the end of the day, we're likely evaluating these things on a high-level dashboard. I think synergy between that and budget discussions is going to be just really helpful for me, and knowing, just having that timing right. So thanks for helping me talk through that out loud.
Thank you, Manager Mafwani. Manager Kitchen?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I do think that we need a process for relating the budget every year back to this set of projects. And that could be done a number of different ways, and it can be done, you know, at points during the year, or it can be done as part of the budget process. But we need to understand how what we're paying for in terms of our budget, where it fits in this structure. So, and you know, and have the KPIs for it and that sort of thing. I think that that's really necessary. So, thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. No? Did I see your hand? No, okay. Oh, I'm seeing Manager Mersaiti's hand. Manager Mersaiti?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that presentation. Really appreciated it. My question really falls on, I have two questions. One is more of a clarification. On slide 21, you have expanded access to specialty care under initiative specialty care coordination, and then you have a care coordination program alignment. So can you differentiate between those two? And so if you can answer that question, I can ask my second one.
Okay.
Thank you, Manager Musaiti. I think if you look at slide number 16 and slide number 17, when we look at specialty care coordination, that is an area both within the Rosewood Zaragoza environment and additional environments that are planned in the future, like Hancock Center, that requires a level of planning that it is its own specialty care coordination work stream with projects and initiatives. And then if you look at care coordination as its own area, that is building out the entire care coordination program, including things like establishing CentralHealth's Patient Navigation Center, making sure that there are delineations between CentralHealth's care coordination and care managers and those of our partners so that we can do warm handoffs, implementing a collaborative care model to support discharge planning in hospitals, expanding the transitions of care team. And if you need more information, Dr. Shalsha can talk about this. A lot of the work that you've already received presentations on in this year is around the general care coordination program and specialty care coordination. Is some of this is based upon how we're aligning and designing work in these particular areas like Rosewood, Zaragoza, and Hancock, that we're building out programs around these facilities. And some of it is around a larger, just overall care coordination model.
Okay, because it was just a little confusing to me because they're both labeled as care coordination. The second question I had, you had a list of, you addressed specialty care, but you did not specify which specialty care. And I was wondering if cancer care was within that specialty, just because that was the need that was addressed to us during the community conversations that you all had.
Yeah, so I'll go back to your previous question because there's something that I wanted to add there as well. So when we think about care coordination from the point of view of specialty care, things like case management would specifically be covered in specialty care and not in primary care or other forms of care coordination. So that's also a clear line of delineation between those two. Because if you think about case management, you need case managers who are taking care of patients who have disease states that are specific to a line of specialty. But when you think about all other care coordination, it's cross-cutting. So it's based in care coordination, but ensures that handoffs are made in an appropriate manner. Now, to answer your second question, cancer care is predominantly in specialty care, but because of the nature of illness that is presented along with the diagnoses that falls within that bucket, primary care will also be part of how that patient gets cared for. So from the point of view of where it ends up on this table, it is within specialty care. But again, the ramifications of providing care to cancer patients cut across both specialty and primary care. Does that help?
Right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manager Musaitis. Manager Jones?
Yes, thanks very much. This is very informative. I have a series of hopefully easy questions to answer. First of all, when we're talking about health equity in closing the gap, where, and perhaps it's already been provided, where are we looking at from where to what? In other words, do we have a data section that is part of what we're going to be presenting to the community as part of our engagement process, so that we're saying this is what the problem is and this is the gap that we're trying to do?
So what we did towards the initial part of this engagement was we identified what the current gap in meeting care needs was. How we did that was we took benchmark data to identify the number of clinical FTEs that would be required to take care of a specific number of patients. And then we compared that benchmark to what we found within CentralHealth's system of care. So as an example, if for primary care, a population of 100 requires 2 primary care physicians, but for CentralHealth we only have 1, the gap there was comparing the 1 to the 2, which was 50%. So we did that data analysis to identify what the existing need within the community was. And with sharing that data with the community.
Well, I mean, we've shared that data with the community through a number of community conversations, through
surveys through direct communication with community members over the past couple of years. We also, in addition to gathering the capacity data and benchmarking it to the expected services that would be available, we went through the voice of the community, worked directly meeting with community members and gathering information from different community groups about their needs that went into our community health needs assessment and gap analysis. Mike?
And just to thank you, and to add to the response, you know, everything that they're talking about references back to that February 22 report, and I think you bring up an excellent point, Manager Jones. We do need to go back and take those gaps, because I don't know if you all remember this, but there were sections of the report that had very precise numbers of saying we need this number of providers because it's causing this gap in the healthcare system, or there's this number of unmet, unenrolled persons. But bringing those back, and I think that's part of the performance, you know, the overall performance indices, if you will, to be able to show, are we actually closing those gaps? And that's going to be additive to things like the demographic report, where we show health indices for certain disease disparities. But, you know, suffice to say, you don't want that February 22 to just been just a snapshot point in time. You've got to bring that forward and bring it current once you start seeing what the results are.
And that's where I was headed. Now, also, and forgive me, I can't recall the report. Are we looking at racial, ethnic, gender specific as well? Because I think it's important that information, we assess that. So I just want to emphasize that. So that was the first question.
And geographically as well.
And geographically, yes, thank you. The second one related to one of the concerns I have, particularly in trying to measure our population, is that 200% of poverty or below, and trying to get a target that population. That number is constantly changing from day to day, to year, to month. So the question is, as we look at strategies for what we're trying to address in terms of improving the health of the population, it's going to be constantly changing. So do we have a way to not do it daily, but annually, maybe look at what does it look like and what impact we're having on the changing population? I know me and one of my colleagues, sort of differ on the population we should be serving. But the question, it would be helpful to know what does that profile of the population looks like, so we can know, yes, we're seeing that much of that population, or no, we're not.
Yes. And we currently have updated monthly. There's about a 60-day lag time, but we have a dashboard that's updated monthly on our website that shows enrollments and utilizations, and has demographic and gender identity, and as well as geographic representations by map of the enrolled population. And so this is going to be individuals below 200% of federal poverty level. Now, in addition to that, we also have I believe it's annual, but it's the board's prerogative to make it more frequently than that, where we come in and compare, prior year's enrollment and utilization. I think we call that the utilization services report, if I'm not mistaken. But there are established workflows right now to come back and answer that very question, so that you can look to see, if you don't have time to go onto the website once a month and track what the data is doing, we understand that, but there's means that we can come back and do just that, because you're absolutely right, it is going to fluctuate, and it's going to change by location as well as by demographic representation.
Okay, thank you. A couple more quick questions. Quick questions. One is that now, when we look at this strategy, are we looking at? I didn't hear our partners talk about. So is this inculcating our partners in terms of this, or is this just what we're doing independent of what our partners are doing?
Yes, and I think in the preface to the comments, there was. And it may have been one statement, but it was also a very important statement that was made. I don't want to steal your thunder on this, Abby, but this is going to be done in concert with partners and stakeholders throughout this, because there's, I'll just stop it. The short answer is yes.
Okay, so when we as board members talk about approving the budget that we have approved that will impact the health equity of our community, we're talking about what we and our partners or the enterprise is doing to address this. This is not just one component of what we're trying to do. This is not just
In a
one
general
agency.
sense, yes. Yes.
So this incorporates all of our partners. That we're
Yes,
talking
so for instance, when you all see the budget, you'll have lines for primary care. Well, then that points to our partners, community care, part of the enterprise, but also Peoples and Lone Star. There's other primary care providers in there. And so those budgets are going to, those budget amounts are going to ultimately fund contracts and agreements that we have with those partners.
Okay, and so finally, so by approving this budget to fund them, they, meaning those agencies, have bought into what we're asking them to do.
I think by virtue of the agreements and the contracts, yes.
Yes, that's right.
I don't want to sit here and represent that they've looked forward 7 years and they agree with every single one of the 150 initiatives. I don't know that.
But it is stipulated in the
But it's in the
contract.
contracts,
Right,
and the agreements that we have.
Okay, all right then, I just don't find ourselves next year, I understand it's down the road, saying, well, this is where we're headed, and then one of our partners said, well, that's not really what our focus is.
Well, and that's to the obvious point about continuing to keep the stakeholders at the table throughout this whole process, so that way everybody can see the next turn around the road.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to what Mike said, I think we need to make sure that we think about what we can do in terms of providing direct care and what our partners can do, understanding that there might be some things that they are better equipped to do than we are right now or at a time in the future. And it's an evolving process depending on how inclusive this process is. We would keep tabs over what our partners are accountable for, given what's in those individual contracts. And I think those would be the driving documents in terms of what we can hold them accountable to.
Thank you.
Manager Kitchen and then Manager Martin.
I wanted to just follow up on the discussion about the disparities. So, I hear the conversation about access, but I'm curious about outcomes. So, is that part of the development of the KPI process? In other words, that we'll be setting goals for improving the outcomes, for example, for for Black moms or for other folks that that are experiencing disparities in the community from an outcome perspective?
Yes. So operational measures are number one. So operational measures around utilization, access would be one. Second would be outcomes, and wherever it applies, it could also be quality of care.
Okay.
So-
The reason I ask is because one of the reasons I ask is I'm not seeing language to that effect in here. I mean, I'm sure it's elsewhere in the project, but when we get down to the pages around the specific projects and around the specific priorities, I'm not seeing healthcare disparities from an outcome perspective spoken to. So I know it's inherent in here, but y'all might think about that when you're putting together, the rest of the material about that.
Yes, Manager Jones.
Yes, that's where I was asking the question specifically about the data. How do we profile that specifically? The other thing that's not in here, or at least I didn't see it, maybe I missed it, but I thought it was inculcated in terms of the bigger, the programs, specific programs that might address these populations, how are they part of the social determinants of health initiatives or funding those programs? Where do they fall, or how do we find out what those programs are within the overall picture of what we're doing?
And so those are great questions, Manager Jones. Thank you. I think if you look at the projects, on page 16, 17, and 18, all of the projects are meant to address the health disparities in our population. Coming up, now the thing that, to your point, Manager Kitchen, we have not, if you look at slide 25, the next step, finalizing the development of the oversight models, reporting structures, and performance tracking plans, including KPIs. I think that's what Dr. Sharma was talking about, and that is work that we are going to do in August and September. We are going to bring those back to you in October and November of this year. So that's the final part, how we are going to track the performance of this work is coming up. And if you look, we aren't just looking to address healthcare disparities through social determinants of health. We really are looking to address healthcare disparities by providing more, better access to healthcare services in areas that are significantly, moderately and significantly gapped. In addition to also doing work around addressing particularly social determinants that relate to accessing healthcare services.
But if I was to look at this and say, where is our program focusing in on Black men's health particularly? Would that be available, be seen here, or is that part and parcel of what we're doing as part of our collaborative through one of our partners? Or if I'm looking at addressing Black Mama's ATX initiative, or I see the homeless one, some of it, I don't see some of those. So where do they fall in this rubric? Not that they need to be here specifically, but I want to make sure that they are incorporated in terms of this. So that's what I'm trying to.
So as we start identifying those KPIs, we will look at specific subpopulations wherever these subpopulations make up a significant proportion of the total population. And then we would track the KPIs along those three lines. So how is access to care being tracked, and how is that improving? How is quality of care being impacted, and how that's improving? And how clinical outcomes per se are improving over the span of that project. So as an example, for diabetics, it could be HbA1c, right? How is that tracking at an individual level as well as at a cohort level by subpopulations wherever these things apply? So to answer your question, yes, it is being tracked. Most of it is in primary care, but again, it depends on what subpopulation we're talking about, because the proportion of that population within that clinical area will be important for us to assess and identify upfront.
And as Mr. Giesland said before, where specific programs are going to be tracked, that will be tracked to contracts that are funded through the budget process every year. And so particularly the Black Mamas and the Black Men's Health Clinic programs they're funded through the community care budget. And so that's where the governance oversight performance measures are, those are in community care and our community care budget.
I'm clear with that. I just want to make sure that when we get down to talk about the budget and budget numbers, that we're all on the same page there.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got 2 minutes. Dr. Martin.
Thank you. I'd like to go into that a bit, because although I agree with this, I think we can direct for too many subpopulations, which would fall under a doctoral degree in public health, versus I think in looking at metrics for the population as a whole. It's very, very difficult, I think, to parse that minutia out, and that's just my opinion as a physician, that it becomes very, very difficult to separate that out. And so I'd ask that we find some modicum of moderation there, that's all. The other thing is not really a question, it's just a comment, it's more for the finance people. I just happen to notice that the second largest line item on the expenses is debt service. And that's a pretty dramatic when 20% of all our budget is going to that. And I don't know how that can be addressed or whatnot, but I just wanted to point it out that it is a large amount of money that's going for that, so. That's
Okay.
it.
Thank you. Manager Kitchen, really quick.
Okay, this could be addressed as, as the KPIs, but what strikes me about this conversation is we're really talking about access, improving access, but it's not just getting people access, it's how you provide the services. And that's why specialized services for certain, with all due respect, Dr. Martin, specialized services for some populations are needed, and I don't see that addressed here. I don't see any words that tell me that we're going to really look at it's sort of inherent in the planning for the care coordination, for example, but this is an health equity model, and we don't really talk about equity in it in a way that people can see. So.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's comments and definitely appreciate your information. Did you guys want to comment on Manager Kitchens or?
Yeah.
Yes, so I think when we think about equity, like Dr. Martin mentioned, I think we have to be careful about which subpopulations we are looking at for what kind of outcome measures, given the predominant presence of a clinical condition within that subpopulation. I think there has to be rationale and thought behind which subpopulations we identify, but we acknowledge the point, and I think wherever it applies, we're going to make sure that it gets highlighted.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that we have a national emergency around maternal care for subpopulation, and we're not talking about that. So.
And I will say to some degree, we do have programs in place.
Yeah,
And
okay.
I would say the
So maybe
first
they're already
place
in
that I would
place.
look at is if you look at the community health needs assessment and the gap analysis. So, and we are also working on, as we're working on the KPIs, on an executive summary of this part of the work as well, that will be nested in, I'm envisioning, I'm a paper person, so I'm investing a book or something, with punch holes in it that includes the community health needs assessment, the voice of the community work, an original gap analysis, the health care equity strategic plan that really identifies both geographically, by race, ethnicity, gender, the gaps that are in place and what needs are being met where, and then we move into the operational and financial sustainability implementation plan that we're in now that is based on the gaps and the needs. And so some work, like our work, with the Black Mamas to provide additional doula services through community care was in places we were taking this on.
Okay, I just wanted, in the whole picture, I want to make sure it's spoken to somewhere.
Sorry. Dr. Goldman.
Dr. Sasha.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Board of Managers. Just thinking about health equity, I heard more access, providing additional access. I think it's also providing different access.
Yeah.
And if we look at, remote care, we look at some of the mechanisms by which we're going to engage in care in this plan. I think the whole plan is called the equity plan, so we didn't mention it on all the line items, but I think what we did try to do, and I think you all have spoken about, Black Mamas, there's a 30 to 50% increase in mortality rate for Black moms who have kids, over the age of 30. And so that is a doula program that is funded by CentralHealth within community care. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to amp up that program and look at other environments where there are some of those disparities, but it may not be here because this is new and this is additional. We may be increasing that, and it shows up in the primary care budget to some of the points that were made earlier. So great points, and I think this whole thing really focuses on equity.
Thank you. I keep forgetting that we're just looking at a slice right now. So,
Thank you, Dr. Charlson.
I was just going to
Mr.
sum this up, Dr. Bell, by saying that as staff, and it's incumbent upon us, all the pieces of the narrative are there. We may just have to rearrange the chapters a little bit, but the idea being we're going to take what we're currently working on today, whether it's Black Men's Health or with the doula pilot program or the dialysis program, and make sure that this work that we're doing today doesn't get lost in the past, that we continue to bring those measures forward along with the other KPIs. And so that's been made clear to us today, and we appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Great discussion, I appreciate it, and thank you again for the information. And I need a motion. We are wanting to adopt this action plan that's been presented to us. There's a motion sheet in front of you. Manager Montwani.
I move that the board adopt the Healthcare Equity Operational and Financial Sustainability Action Plan as presented and direct staff to implement the plan.
Okay, I have a motion from Manager Montwani. I have a second from Manager Zamora. Any further discussion?
Right here. I just want to make sure that to the degree that we can embed in the motion with the caveats, considering the discussions that have been had at our meeting, be added to the motion for adoption to ensure that those things do occur.
Considering so you want to make sure that not only the motion of adopting the plan, but that the plan considers the discussion that the board members have had today and the suggestions on those revisions that we have suggested.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
I'm good with that.
You good with that? That will be the motion. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstaining? It passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay. Agenda item number 2 is to discuss updates and take possible action on the performance review contracted by Travis County, including delegations to the President and CEO to execute necessary agreements between CentralHealth, Travis County, and Mazars USA. Mike Giesen will be presenting. We will be going.
Dr. Bell, I'm sorry.
Don't need to go into closed session.
Yeah, there's been a quick update, and so we will not need to go into closed session unless there are specific questions from members. Okay. Thank you, members. After this meeting started a little bit over an hour ago, I did receive a document from Travis County. I've not had the opportunity to review it. Obviously, we've been in this meeting, but there's a couple of points that we're still trying to iron out, and I would say principally among them, making sure that we can lawfully and legally share data throughout this whole process. But I'll leave it at that and give us a chance to look at this document and then bring something back to you, and then request permission to execute.
Okay.
That's what I got.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Giesler.
Thank you.
Okay, then agenda item number 3 is to confirm the next regular board meeting date, time, and location. Managers, our next CentralHealth Board of Managers meeting is tentatively scheduled for Wednesday, August the 23rd, 2023 at 4 p.m. or immediately after the Executive Committee meeting at CentralHealth Administrative Offices, 1111 East Cesar Chavez, Austin, Texas, 78702. At this time, I'm ready to accept a motion for adjournment. Manager Martin motions adjourn. Manager Montgomery seconds. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you, members. Appreciate your time.
Did I get yours too?
I think you're around for